Hello everyone, welcome to our Meetings Assistance for Jehovah's Witnesses channel. I hope you are all doing well. In this video, we will prepare for the book study, Complete Testimony, for the week of May 12th to 18th. This week, we will study chapter 26, paragraphs 9 to 17. Questions 9 and 10. What difficulties did they face near Crete? Near Crete, the crew faced unfavorable winds that prevented them from making progress toward the west. As they moved away from the current that was helping them, the wind pushed them southward. Although they found some protection on the island of Crete, the approaching winter still posed a danger to them. At Fair Havens, they were able to stop for a while due to the bad conditions, but they knew that the longer they waited, the more dangerous it would be to continue, as winter was approaching. Additional comments. Despite the temporary protection offered by the island of Crete, the crew continued to face difficulties with the winds and the instability of the weather. The mention of the unfavorable wind highlights how natural forces could dramatically alter the course of journeys, testing the sailors' resilience. The fact that they couldn't stay long at Fair Havens emphasizes how the passage of time increased the danger of their voyage. The proximity of winter was a constant threat, and the longer they waited, the more risky the situation became. This shows the urgency of making decisions quickly in adverse conditions. Question 11. What did Paul recommend, but what decision was made? Paul recommended not continuing to sail, as he warned that they could suffer damage and heavy loss, including possible deaths. However, the pilot, the shipowner, and most of the passengers decided to proceed, trusting that they would reach a safer harbor. They ultimately decided to head for the port of Phoenix, where they hoped to find a proper refuge for the winter. Additional comments. Paul, with his prior travel experience, recommended caution by pointing out the imminent dangers. However, the decision to continue reflects how, sometimes, logic and experience are ignored in the hope of finding a quick solution. This contrast emphasizes the importance of listening to wise advice, especially in risky situations. The gentle south wind made the crew feel secure and confident in continuing the journey, despite the warnings. This detail shows how, at times, a favorable sign can lead to hasty decisions without considering long-term dangers, often resulting in negative consequences. Question 12. What dangers did they face when leaving Crete, and how did the sailors try to avoid a tragedy? When they left Crete, they faced a very strong northeast wind that threatened to blow them toward the African coast and cause them to run aground on sandbanks. To avoid a tragedy, the sailors took desperate measures, such as reinforcing the ship's hull with ropes and chains, lowering the sails, and struggling to keep the ship oriented against the wind. Additionally, on the third day, they threw the rigging overboard to lighten the ship. Additional comments. Despite their efforts, such as reinforcing the ship and throwing equipment overboard, the storm continued to shake them violently. This demonstrates how, even with all the precautions and measures they took, there were factors beyond their control, highlighting human vulnerability in the face of natural elements. The act of throwing the rigging overboard reflects the sailors' desperation. This action shows how, in times of crisis, difficult decisions often have to be made to try to save what remains, even if success is not guaranteed, underlining the uncertainty in extreme situations. Question 13. What was life like on board the ship during the storm? Life on board the ship during the storm must have been extremely difficult. Everyone was terrified, but Paul and his companions remained calm, trusting that they would survive because Jesus had assured Paul that he would reach Rome. The storm struck the ship day and night for 2 weeks, with the rain never stopping and the sky never clearing. The pilot couldn't navigate due to the lack of visibility, and the sailors couldn't even eat because of the fear and extreme conditions. Additional comments. Despite the widespread fear, Paul remained calm, trusting in the divine promise that he would reach Rome. This highlights how faith and trust in divine promises can bring peace even in the most terrifying situations, showing the contrast between the distress of others and the security Paul found in his relationship with God. The storm not only affected the ship but also the crew's ability to function. The lack of food, constant fear, and extreme conditions like the cold and rain stripped the sailors of their physical and emotional strength. This shows how, in extreme situations, basic needs like food and well-being are overshadowed by fear and adverse conditions. Questions 14 and 15, Part A. When speaking to the people on the ship, why did Paul remind them of what he had already warned them about? Paul reminded them of what he had already warned them about to make it clear that it was worth listening to his advice. He didn't do it to reproach them, but so that they could understand that following his warnings could have spared them suffering. The reminder was a way to encourage them, as although the ship would be lost, their lives would be saved. Additional comments. Paul's reminder highlights how, even though his advice was not heeded before, the serious situation now showed the validity of what he had said. This emphasizes the importance of paying attention to wise warnings, as poor decisions can bring consequences, but it's never too late to change course. Paul not only reminded them of his previous words but also used them to offer hope amid the storm. His intervention reflects how, despite adversity, the role of a spiritual leader is to offer encouragement and hope, always pointing to God's faithfulness and promises. Questions 14 and 15, Part B. What does the hope Paul gave to the people remind us of? The hope Paul gave them reminds us that, even in desperate circumstances, faith in God's promises can provide comfort and security. Despite the storm, Paul assured them that everyone would survive, reminding them of the divine intervention through the angel, which reaffirmed their trust that God will fulfill his promises. Additional comments. The hope Paul transmitted highlights how faith in God's promises can be a source of peace even in the most terrifying times. His certainty that God would fulfill what was promised gave him the security to face the storm without fear, a reminder that faith can bring calm in the storm. The hope Paul gave was not only based on the promise of survival, but also on the fact that God had a plan for each person on the ship. This reflects God's mercy, which not only protects but also intervenes to guide people through difficulties, showing that divine hope is always present, even in the hardest circumstances. Questions 16 and 17, Part A. What moment did Paul take advantage of to pray, and what effect did his prayer have? Paul took advantage of the moment when the ship was a little more stable, after they had dropped anchor to prevent being dragged. At that moment, he encouraged them to eat and publicly thanked God for their survival. His prayer had a significant effect, as everyone was encouraged and began to eat, which gave them the emotional and physical strength to face what was ahead. Additional comments. Paul prayed with gratitude in front of everyone, and his example of faith and gratitude provided great relief and encouragement to the crew. This highlights how prayer, especially when shared in times of crisis, can strengthen others and offer them peace by reminding them of God's sovereignty and provision. Paul didn't only pray asking for help but also thanked God. This attitude of gratitude, even amid the storm, is a powerful testimony of faith. In difficult moments, gratitude can be a powerful tool to shift people's focus from despair to hope. Questions 16 and 17, Part B. How was what Paul had predicted fulfilled? What Paul had predicted was fulfilled when, despite the soldiers' attempts to kill the prisoners, all 276 passengers reached land safely. Paul had assured them that, although the ship would be lost, everyone would survive, and his prediction came true when the ship ran aground and the survivors swam or floated to shore. Additional comments. Paul's prediction was fulfilled exactly as he had said, demonstrating God's faithfulness to keep his promises. Although the situation seemed hopeless, divine intervention ensured the safety of everyone on board, showing that God always fulfills what he promises, even in extreme circumstances. The fulfillment of Paul's prediction also highlights how God uses his servants to communicate hope and security amid chaos. Paul's certainty not only inspired the crew but showed that, when following God's will, we can trust that God's promises will be carried out, regardless of the circumstances. Well, these have been the practical answers for this week's congregation book study. I hope it will be of great help to you, my dear brothers and sisters. I send you a big hug, and may Jehovah bless and protect you always.